Hello and welcome to Child Welfare, lecture number 8 on fetal abuse. More uplifting information for you. Alright, so the definition of fetal abuse includes any maternal behaviors that put the fetus at risk for harm, particularly the ingestion of drugs while pregnant. Now, one might take a step back and say, what about dad? There are, I'm sure, things dad could do to mom that might qualify under a different legal heading, but certainly there are things that fathers can do, for, in particular, domestic violence is the first one that pops into my head, that could put the fetus at risk for harm. In terms of incidence, this word incidence, what that means is number of times per year that something occurs. This is a very difficult thing to determine, fetal abuse incidence per year. Estimates tend to vary by sample and source, but we do know that it is a significant problem. Some of the causes of fetal abuse include, and some of these are no-brainers, you may already have guessed, addiction, depression, and I would put in parentheses other mental health issues, mixed feelings about pregnancy, alcohol use before pregnancy, victim of abuse, exposure to violence, lack of education, pregnant teens who feel pushed around. What's rare is thinking that the fetus is attacking or depriving the mother. And in those instances, we may be talking a little bit more about other mental health issues. In terms of some of the stuff that we know about maternal mental health, the World Health Organization says that depression and anxiety are approximately twice as prevalent globally in women as men. And are at their highest rates in the life cycle during childbearing years from puberty to menopause. Studies of depression and anxiety show their incidence to be approximately 5% in non-pregnant women and approximately 8 to 10% during pregnancy, and highest during the year following delivery. Some of the effects of drug use on prenatal development. We have some methodological problems in terms of identifying the specific causes and drugs associated with specific problems. There's also the problem of oftentimes more than one drug is used when a parent is using substances, and so it's difficult to separate those out. Sometimes there are co-occurring negative factors, like it's not unusual to find domestic violence in situations where the mom is already drinking or using drugs, as well as the timing of the exposure. So at what point in the pregnancy is the fetus exposed to the toxins? So a little bit about infant withdrawal. You'll see a clip on this, which is really not, it's a little disturbing. So make sure you have some tissue. Some of the things we know about alcohol, it's the leading cause of fetal death, malformations, and neurodevelopmental symptoms. It increases the risk of spontaneous abortion, low birth weight, and asphyxia. There is no safe amount in terms of the research that's out there. There's no clear line between low and moderate consumption, and we know that moderate consumption can have big impacts as well. Fetal alcohol syndrome is when there are birth defects related to consumption. There are some children born to alcoholic mothers who appear not to have been affected, and some who look okay but developmentally have great difficulty, and that's what we call fetal alcohol effects. You'll also see some clips on both fetal alcohol syndrome as well as fetal alcohol effects. Some of the characteristics of fetal alcohol syndrome, you'll find encephalopathy, you'll find a smaller head, a short eyelid opening. I had a psychiatrist who used to refer to them as cat's eyes, a flat mid-face, a smooth philtrum, the part just under your nose, how it's all of us have like an indented sort of thing. Those folks with fetal alcohol syndrome, it won't be indented. You'll see an underdeveloped jaw, a thin upper lip, a short nose. The folds in their eyes will look differently, as well as a low nasal bridge. As far as cocaine exposure, there is some controversial research findings in terms of it having impact as well as not having much impact. There was some real extreme media response to the whole crack cocaine baby epidemic, and that was supposed to happen in the early 90s. And what we found is it really didn't happen in the way that the media sort of let us believe that it was. We're going to have this onset of all these kids with these significant problems. It hasn't quite happened in the way that we thought that it would. We do need better studies to look at more of the minor effects of substances, including minor exposure. Some research has shown that these kids who've been exposed to cocaine have a smaller head circumference, that there are higher rates of strokes and miscarriage, but there are long-term studies that are lacking. As far as methamphetamine exposure, there have been a series of animal birth defects that have demonstrated in research that there are certainly impacts. We know that some of these kids have low birth weight. The long-term effects in the research are mixed. Some findings show low brain activation, others show nothing. In terms of marijuana, we know that it's the most commonly used illicit drug, that it does have some effects on the fetus or neonate. There is some stuff where there may be some connections to externalizing disorders. However, again, long-term effects, we need more research on it. So as you guys grow up professionally and you're doing more things, these studies might be worthy of your time and attention. Some of the research out there on marijuana, kids who are born to moms who used marijuana have shown increased behavioral problems in infancy and preschool years. In school, these kids are having problems with memory and attention, so they may be diagnosed with ADHD. Other studies show that cannabis in pregnancy, there was this one study done in Jamaica where pregnant women and their children were studied for over 10 years. Both marijuana smokers and non-smokers were included in the study. It was one of the first scientific studies of the effects that cannabis may have on pregnancy and the child's development thereafter. And this specific research showed no long-term development. But again, it's one of many that need to be done. In terms of nicotine, there are high incidents of kids exposed to nicotine prenatally. There are effects on the fetus, and there are some long-term effects. We know that in terms of prenatal smoking, exposure but not low birth weight predicted oppositional defiant disorder, independent of other variables. Prenatal smoking also predicted conduct disorder. And we do know that prenatal smoking exposure may contribute to oppositional defiant disorder, which later leads to conduct disorder. But there has not, in some of the research that's out there, has not been a specific association with attention deficit disorder. And this will lead you to a clip about smoking, but I'll show you that in the unit itself. There we go. Now I got it to move on. Heroin. We do see some effects on the fetus and neonate. There are long-term effects as well as effects with the use of methadone and buprenorphine. Can you tell that it's not something I've really seen much of? Now this chart, which is kind of a nice one, comes from this book called Ghosts from the Nursery. That's a nice text when we're looking at the text itself. Was a research study in where the roots of violence come from, and so it looked at the research out there on these 4 drugs and the impacts of these drugs on prenatal development, and what they found in these kids after they were born. And you'll find alcohol impacts everything. Hyperactivity, aggression, cognitive delays, irritability, all that stuff. Cocaine, you'll see it separates out a little bit more, as well as heroin. But you'll find with nicotine, definitely closely associated with externalizing disorders in kids. So smoking while pregnant, not such a good thing. And I know everybody used to do it. That's what I always hear. But maybe that's why we see an uptick in diagnostic uh, categories. So in terms of responding to fetal abuse, we'll cover a little bit about some of the treatment, the mandated reporting, and the criminal prosecution of it. So in terms of some of the prosecution of pregnant women, and I'll put this link up on the unit. In Milwaukee, I pulled this off a Milwaukee link. A pregnant Wisconsin woman has filed a federal challenge to the state's fetal protection law after being confined in a drug treatment center for more than 2 months, even though she said she'd already weaned herself off dependence on painkillers. Alicia Beltran was held this summer under a 1997 Wisconsin law that allows officials to force women into treatment to protect their unborn children. 3 other states, Minnesota, Oklahoma, and South Dakota, have similar laws. Let's see. According to court documents, Beltran, 28, of Jackson, Wisconsin, was about 3 months pregnant in July when she went to a clinic in West Bend for a prenatal checkup. She told a physician's assistant she'd just finished treatment for what she thought was a problem with a painkiller Percocet. The physician's assistant contacted a social worker who suggested Beltran continue taking an anti-addiction drug. Beltran declined. She was arrested days later and eventually taken to a drug treatment facility in Appleton, where she was held even though a urine test showed no evidence of drug use. The New York Times reported Beltran was held at the clinic until earlier this month, after the federal challenge was filed on her behalf in Milwaukee. The challenge asked the federal court to declare the law unconstitutional, saying it punishes pregnant women and violates their rights to privacy, due process, and freedom for illegal searches and seizures. It names as defendants, blah, blah, blah. You don't need to know all that sort of stuff. But so interesting that this is a law in Wisconsin passed in 97. So the question is, should states be allowed to charge pregnant women with abuse of the fetus? In this particular case, if you think that there are areas of gray. What about a woman who has 1 glass of wine while she is pregnant at 2 months? And the question also comes at, where do you draw the lines? How specific do you want to be? There are some other key cases. Johnson versus State demonstrates the controversial aspects of such prosecutions. In this case, a Florida District Court of Appeal upheld a lower court's conviction of a woman for delivery of a controlled substance by umbilical cord to 2 of her 4 children. Jennifer Johnson, a 23-year-old resident of Seminole County, Florida, had been arrested in 1989 after 2 successive instances in which a child born to her tested positive for cocaine immediately after birth. The ACLU appealed the case with backing from an unusual alliance of medical and civil rights organizations, including the AMA. The AMA stated it opposed the use of criminal prosecutions against mothers. Imposing criminal sanctions, it says, does not prevent damage to fetal health and may violate privacy laws between doctors and women. In the McKnight case, I wasn't going to go through all of these because I figured you guys might be interested in specific ones on your own. But just to kind of highlight the first and the last. The South Carolina Supreme Court Monday threw out the homicide by child abuse conviction of Regina McKnight, the first woman in South Carolina to be convicted on that charge for suffering an unintentional stillbirth after having used cocaine during her pregnancy. In its ruling in McKnight versus South Carolina, the court held that McKnight received inadequate counsel during her trial and that her conviction was based on outdated and inaccurate information linking fetal death to her cocaine use. McKnight was arrested in 1999, several months after she experienced a stillbirth at a Conway hospital. She was convicted of homicide by child abuse in 2001, after a jury bought scientifically unsupported arguments that her cocaine use caused the stillbirth. Although McKnight had no prior conviction and even prosecutors agreed she had no intention of harming the fetus, she was sentenced to 12 years in prison with no chance of parole. So, Are there other issues going on? Some of the things to think about, you guys won't be able to do this. Maybe I'll do this as part of a discussion board with this Springer link. The New York Times looked at pregnant women, and they found some links between race and class and the role of drug use, which brings up some very specific questions about the law, who it's designed to address or correct, and how race and class play a role in that sort of stuff. If you look at historically the war on drugs, that link has been made as well. We tended not to go after opium, for example, until we essentially had indentured servants or slaves who were Chinese, who we made work on the railroads, and their sort of break from the end of the night, and also, quite honestly, as part of some religious practices or rituals, was to smoke opium. And as soon as that started spreading beyond them and getting into the white majority, legislation came down the line. So we need to think about the timing of these sorts of things and how race and class are a part of this as well. So to understand some of this process, the legal process, there's this thing called civil commitment, whereby people who pose a danger to themselves or others can be court ordered to receive treatment, including inpatient treatment. And I've seen this just a couple of times in women who were severely mentally ill, where they were required to take medication. In fetal abuse cases, the danger comes more from chemical dependency. Now, CAPTA plays a role in this, and I think we've talked about CAPTA before, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. This requires states to have some policies or procedure in place to notify CPS of substance exposed newborns and establish a plan of safe care for these newborns. Some states specify in their statutes that the response to the CPS agency must make to report substance-exposed neonates. Maine, for example, requires the state agency to develop a plan of safe care for the infant. California, Maryland, Minnesota, Missouri, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia require the agency to complete an assessment of needs for the infant or for the infant's family and make a referral to appropriate services. Illinois and Minnesota require mandated reporters to report when they suspect that pregnant women are substance abusers, so the women can be referred for treatment. Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, Nevada, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Virginia have enacted specific reporting procedures for drug-exposed infants. As well as, and I'm going to list a bunch of states here, so hang on, Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Carolina, South Dakota, Texas, Virginia, and Wisconsin include exposure of infants to drugs in their definition of child abuse or neglect, which means you as mandated reporters will be making hotline calls in these instances. In terms of where specific organizations stand, the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists state that although no state specifically criminalizes drug abuse during pregnancy, prosecutors have relied on a host of established criminal laws to punish women for prenatal substance abuse. As of September 1st, 2010, 15 states consider substance abuse during pregnancy to be child abuse under civil child welfare statutes, and 3 consider it grounds for involuntary commitment to a mental health or substance abuse treatment facility. Some of the motivations for responding to alleged fetal abuse, of course, have to do with the health of the fetus. Part of it has to do with our societal views on drug use and punishing the mom in particular for drug use. There's also elements of this that are unsaid in the law that have to do with, and I talked a little about this, racial and social class bias. Some of the prenatal exposure and risk of harm after birth, mothers who use drugs are at an increased risk for maltreatment. However, many themselves are not abusive. Many have other problems and issues, and think of domestic violence, lack of supports, and that sort of stuff. And ideally, we would address these things on a case-by-case basis, taking culture and specific context into consideration. That's all I have for this unit. As far as the lecture is concerned, good luck.